Hey grade 10s, welcome to the last section of mammalian tissue. This is the nerve tissue and probably one of the most important and what kind of defines you as being a higher order mammal. All right, this is an extremely important tissue because this will rock up again. Well, actually all of them will rock up in grade 11 again, but this one more so right at the end when we do the nervous system itself. And it's just a fair warning that it's not exactly easy. So try and grab as much information out of this as possible, and let's see how this goes. All right, so first we're going to talk about a nerve impulse and how it briefly works. So the body receives a stimulus, and a stimulus can be anything from touch, anything from one of your senses, your five senses, and hopefully you know what those are. And those stimuli or stimuli, the plural is stimuli and one is stimulus, they are then recognized by the nerves. Then the nerves conduct the impulse to the brain or the body. So this is one of the only, actually I think it is, no it isn't, one of the most important tissues that actually conduct electrical impulses. Okay, so they deal with electricity specifically. And so for instance, if you get electrocuted, that is often why your body doesn't really work, because you have affected your nerves in such a way that they are now misfunctioning or misfiring for that matter. Anyway, once the body receives a stimulus and the nerve conducts the message of what stimulus you have received, the body then responds to the stimulus. So for instance, someone is running at you with a knife, the stimulus is your eyes pick it up, the eyes send a message to the brain, and the brain sends a message to your effector organs or your muscles in this instance, and it says run. Okay, so the body is able to figure out what the input is and try and produce some sort of output. If we look at neurons as a whole, neurons technically is another word for nerves, okay, but neurons make up nerve tissue. You could also just say nerves make up nerve tissue, but the other word is neurons, okay? And they are easily stimulated and transmit impulses easily, which means that they can really be like you can respond very quickly, and that is because of certain electrical impulses that occur and how the impulse is actually created and then moved across. We're not going to deal with that this year, but I will briefly mention how we can actually make it move even faster when we do myelinated neurons a little bit later. For now, you need to know that there are three types of nerves or neurons. That is your sensory neuron, motor or multipolar, and we'll talk about that later. And then we have your interneurons, okay? And all three are extremely important when a lot of this goes down. And I want you to think in your head, often when you have bumped your arm and your arm moves, and then maybe only like half a minute later you recognize how sore it truly is, and that is almost because your brain has two pathways. It can either like go to the brain, or it can go from sensory to inter and then straight to neuron, and then your body can respond in a specific way without the brain actually having to recognize what is going on if the body is set up correctly so that it can function. These are also called your reactions. All right, so let's have a look at the sensory and interneuron. What I've done on the right hand side is I've included some diagrams. You will not have to be able to draw either the inter or the sensory neuron, but I would expect you to be able to identify this very specifically for grade 11 as well. So what is and what does the sensory neuron do? It conducts impulses from a sensory organ, so example your eyes, your ears, your skin, to the central nervous system. That is its job. Okay, that's all you need to know, from the sense organ to the central nervous system. And what is your central nervous system? That includes your brain and your spinal column. Okay, so those are the only two components of the central nervous system. Anything else is your peripheral nervous system. Then we have your interneurons, which connect sensory neurons to your motor neurons. Okay, so they're a way for the sensory neurons to communicate with the motor neurons so that we're able to have this reflex. And the way that it does it is it connects via the interneuron, which is at the top right hand side of the slide over there. We can also call an interneuron a connector or association neuron. I am 100% okay if you call them interneurons. And remember, the word inter is different to the word intra. Inter means between two different objects, okay? So interneuron would be the neuron between two different kinds of nerves, okay? And the two different kinds are sensory and motor. And remember, the word intra means between two of the same, okay? So let's have a look at this motor neuron idea. This is probably the most important out of all three of them, as I will really expect you to be able to draw this and answer questions quite extensively. I'll also cover the very complex structure of the motor neuron, and you'll have to note that to a large extent, even though they look different, they kind of, all nerves have very similar components about them. Or constituents. So what does a motor neuron do? It conducts impulses from, and I've bolded it, the central nervous system to an effector organ, okay? So we had sensory neurons dealing with the senses to the central nervous system. Now we're going from the central nervous system to an effector organ. What is an effector organ? They are muscles and glands. Now, glands, you can think to yourself, okay, yeah, you know, I create spit, that's a gland. But there are a whole bunch of other ones, like your adrenal glands, okay? So adrenaline glands, there are a whole bunch of glands that are attached in your digestive system, so that if you start eating, something is sending a message to the brain saying, we are eating. Please start producing certain things from the glands, like enzymes and digestive juices and water and salts and all those other wonderful bits and pieces. So let's have a look at the actual structure itself. And on the left hand side, I've included what a motor neuron attaches to, how it actually attaches to an effector organ. So that is a muscle. Hopefully you can pick that up from the striations on the muscle itself. You can see an axon, a synaptic knob, and then a motor end plate. That motor end plate is a way for the body to communicate an impulse onto a muscle, okay? So muscles also to some extent respond to electricity as well, but that is caused because of movement of calcium. Don't be too phased about that. I just want you to know the term motor end plate. That is the way that we connect a motor neuron to a muscle. So the structure is they have dendrites and they have axons, all right? So they're called cytoplasmic extensions because if you took a cell and you pulled it out really thin, okay, into this rod-like structure, and you just took the end of one and started pulling up the edges, those would create little cytoplasmic extensions. And those cytoplasmic extensions are called the dendrites. Now, after that, we have the axon. So one side is the dendrite, the other side is the axon, and this extends towards another dendrite to form a motor end plate. Okay, so what you will find out when we go through a little bit later, an impulse is moved from a dendrite to an axon. All right, you need to know that. I like to ask that. So let's have a look at some more structure over here. We have impulses that only move in one direction. Okay, only one direction, and you only want it to move in one direction because if it changes, you will actually move the impulse in the wrong direction and could actually cause more chaos in the brain. So it needs to only be from one end to the other end, and that is from the dendrite to the axon. What I have included over here is it says dendrite into the body and axon away from the body. Now, what on earth is the body? This is the cell body, okay? So in the diagram at the bottom over there, I've included 3 different kinds of neurons. And what you can see over there is that those arrows are pointing towards the cell bodies, okay? So it's almost like the main part where you're going to find the nucleus of the entire neuron. So cell body has a cell membrane and central nucleus, okay? And the nucleus is extremely important in this instance because if the nucleus is the brain of the cell, and this is allowing for impulses to move around, move between the dendrites and the axon, it needs to be extremely specific in what is produced that allows for a very specific kind of impulse and message. This cell body, though, contains granules called Nissel's bodies. They're just rough endoplasmic reticulum. Remember that rough endoplasmic reticulum is just the cell membrane that is folded, and then it is rough because it has ribosomes on, so it's able to produce a lot of proteins, and we'll see where the proteins come in a little bit later. So it's almost like nerves don't only just function on electrical impulses, but they also function on proteins that are moved between the dendrite and the axon, because electricity can't just jump through air or just through liquid like in your body. It needs to be very, very specific. We also have the neurofibrils or neurofibrils, depending how you feel like saying it, and they are for support. So they are this structure, these highways that hold up the entire structure of the neuron that gives it its shape and to a large extent eventually its function. So these are those three things I just mentioned: the cell body, the neurofilaments, and the Nissel's bodies. Okay, so you can see the Nissel bodies, the Nissel granules, or the Nissel bodies at the bottom left-hand corner over there. Those little dark black spots are the ribosomes, surrounded by a lot of cell membrane. Then we have the cell body at the top left-hand corner, and that dark empty spot in the middle is known as the nucleus. And then finally, someone really smart attached some bioluminescent pigments to the neurofilaments, and that's how we're able to see them under a purple light. All right, so there's a whole bunch of things that are going to be moving and so on and so forth. So I'm going to take a moment just to talk while you can see everything move. All right, so now around these nerves, you can imagine that electricity is able to jump out of a exposed cable, right? So if there was a wire that was connected into the plug and you touched it and it didn't have plastic around it, you would get shocked. So you want to avoid that at all costs. So what we do is we put this layer called the myelin sheath around it. It's a whitish, fatty, non-cellular layer around the axon. Okay, and we'll show you pictures of what the axon look like a little bit later. They're surrounded and produced by a Schwann cell or neurolemma. Okay, so you really need to know the word Schwann cell, and also note that it is someone's surname. Okay, and if it's someone's surname, it needs to have a capital. You can see how that Schwann cell actually wraps around the axon in the top right hand corner over there in the bottom right hand corner, and as it wraps itself around, it actually starts to secrete a fatty like substance, and that insulates the axon. And if it insulates the axon, that means the electrical impulse can't be lost. Okay, so you don't want all of your neurons to have this myelin sheath, but the really long ones, and ones that are, some of them go up to about 1 meter long, that run down your back and into your legs, those really need to be myelinated. So the myelin sheath is not continuous, so there are many Schwann cells along the entire structure of the length of the axon, and they wrap it around. So if you're going to have individual cells, there's going to be areas of which looks like dips, and you can see from the bottom left hand corner, there's these areas where there is no Schwann cells, and those holes are called the nodes of Ranvier. How cool is that? Such a cool name. Okay, so there's a node of Ranvier, and they are surrounding the entire length of the axon. Then, when I said to you, there needs to be communication between the axon and the dendrite. So now you can see in this diagram that I've included, it says their action potential. Don't worry about that word. It's for grade 11. But you need to see that the left-hand side of each one of those nerves has those cytoplasmic extensions called the, waiting for it, dendrite. And at the other end, on the right-hand side of each one of those nerves, is the axon. So the action potential is the movement of electricity from the dendrite to the axon. Now, where these two cells should be meeting, or like sharing their information or the message, is called the synapse. However, the synapse is a place where the two cells never meet, because if they touched each other, that means that the electrical impulse could go all the way through, and that would ultimately cause bigger problems. Okay, so you need to move one message at a time, stop, and then release something called a neurotransmitter. Now you'll see the bottom left hand corner over there, right at the bottom there's a label that says neurotransmitter, and those are proteins that are released as a result of the electricity. Okay, so the electricity tells the body to create these proteins, and those proteins then are what is moved between the synapse from the end of one axon to the beginning of the next dendrite. Okay, now there's a whole bunch of science about how the synapse works, and we'll delve into that next year, but you just need to know the synapse is where two nerve cells meet, they don't touch, and they use neurotransmitters. Okay, so this is just the general structure of a motor neuron now. We've spoken about this quite a bit. You can see the dendrite at the top left-hand corner. The axon runs from the cell body all the way down, and eventually the axon branches out, and we create the axon, well, like eventually the synaptic knobs and the motor end plate that is on that particular muscle, and it's wrapped in myelin, which probably means it is a very important nerve. So now I want you to stop, and I want you to draw this entire thing, please. It is going to take very long, and I will ask this diagram. I'm telling you now, I will do it. And I will ask you to draw and label, or either draw and label or just label, but you will have to know this off by heart. I recommend drawing this at least 10 times. It is just that important, okay? So now, I was talking about it earlier about how a stimulus is received and then it's moved through, and sometimes it doesn't have to go through the actual, what do you call it? The central nervous system, and this is how it works, okay? So this is a stimuli impulse response kick. So on the top right-hand corner over there, we have a sense organ. This specific sense organ is just is the skin. Okay, so it's got some pressure plates and all those wonderful things. An impulse is received, and then it is moved to the left, okay, of the sensory neuron. You'll note that its cell body is off of the axon and the dendrites, okay, and that's what makes this important. Then eventually it hits the interneuron, which is at the middle of the left-hand side over there, and that is transmitted directly into a motor neuron, and from the motor neuron it goes directly to an effector organ, and the effector organ in this instance is the skeletal muscle. Okay, so we have a receptor, we have the sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, effector organ, and then there is some sort of response. Okay, so these are the 4 functions of the nervous system, and the nerves specifically, you need to know at least 3. They send stimuli in both internal and external environments. Remember, your body needs to recognize what's happening on the inside as well as what's happening on the outside. The stimuli are analyzed and integrated to allow for coordinated and proper responses of various organs. Okay, so the big word over there is coordination. I'm happy with that. Conduct impulses from the sense organs to the CNS, or the central nervous system, and then finally transmit impulses from the CNS to the muscle or effector organ, which reacts to the initial stimulus. All right, I'm sorry, I know this lesson is a bit long, but I mean, you can just pause it and take your time. If you don't finish it in one sitting, let me know. All right, ladies, have a good day. Cheers.